Imagine yourself aboard an old ship, one of those that sailed the seas during the great voyages. The wood of the deck creaks with every step. The sails, puffed up by the salty ocean wind, dance slowly in the cloudy sky. The sound of the waves crashing against the hull is constant, almost hypnotic. There is a smell in the air that mixes salt, mold, sweat, and something undefined. Something that seems to come from the depths of the ship. A strange, almost disturbing aroma. You go down a narrow staircase, where the torchlight flickers on the damp walls. The air becomes heavier, the room becomes darker, and then you reach a small wooden door, marked by rust, soot, and the unsettling silence of something forgotten by time. What was hidden behind the kitchens of old ships? What really happened in the preparation of food on the high seas? How was it possible to feed dozens, sometimes hundreds of men for months in extreme conditions, without technology, without refrigeration, without any of the luxuries we know today? And what's more, how did these methods, even rudimentary ones, give rise to techniques and principles that, centuries later, would shape the industrial food processes we use today? Few people ask themselves this question. Almost no one imagines that what we eat today on the supermarket shelves may have its roots in the harsh, often desperate practices of sailors from centuries past. What is now made with machines, automated production lines, microbiological control, and sophisticated packaging was once a challenge of survival on the high seas. Before industrial processes for preserving and distributing food, even before the science behind nutrition, there was only one need: to stay alive. This is the story you are about to discover. A dark, fascinating, and completely real story. Sailors lived under relentless rules. Food was not just sustenance. It was control. It was power. And often, it was the difference between order and chaos, between obedience and mutiny, between life and death. Have you ever stopped to think about how it was possible to preserve meat during 3, 4, or even 5-month ocean crossings? There was no ice. There were no cold rooms. What there was salt, a lot of patience, and methods that today we would consider almost medieval. The meat was submerged in giant barrels filled with brine, and there it remained for weeks, fermenting, hardening, taking on smells and textures that few today would tolerate. The same happened with the fish and the bread. It was not soft, fresh, or tasty. It was hard as a rock, made to last, not to please. The sea biscuits, the famous sailors' biscuits, often had to be beaten with the handle of a knife to be able to chew them. Often they came accompanied by little surprises, like insects. And even with all these methods, diseases such as scurvy caused by vitamin C deficiency ravaged the crews. This was because the lack of fresh food pushed the body to its limits. So sailors resorted to desperate solutions: teas made with tree bark, attempts to ferment fruit, and anything else that might seem mildly nutritious. The galleys of ancient ships were not clean or organized places. They were cramped, dark, and often dangerous, and run by men who had to deal with shortages, intense heat, unstable fires, and ingredients spoiling before their very eyes. But don't think that everything was just improvisation. What's impressive is to realize how, even back then, principles that are now part of modern industry were already being applied, albeit unconsciously. Techniques for smoking, fermentation, drying, salting, and preserving in fat were already being used with strategic precision. Each ship carried veritable rudimentary laboratories, where necessity and creativity gave rise to solutions that defied time. Salted meat from ships, for example, is one of the precursors of modern charcuterie. Dried fish from Scandinavian ships gave rise to industrial practices that are still respected today. And this is where the story begins to take on a different shape. Because the more we delve into this universe, the more we realize how tenuous the line between ancient and modern is. The food industry as we know it today, with its rigorous quality standards, controlled stages, hermetic packaging, and elaborate preservatives, did not emerge out of nowhere. It has deep roots in the ships that crossed oceans, driven by wind and hunger. In this video, you will learn not only about the foods that were part of the maritime diet, but also about the processes behind each preparation, the backstage of a floating kitchen, and the extreme challenges faced by cooks who were often as important as the captain himself. You will discover that the simple act of preparing a meal on board required engineering, strategy, and often sacrifice. Get ready to revisit a forgotten chapter in the history of food. Get ready to discover that the evolution of the food industry didn't begin in factories, but on the decks of storm-battered ships. And get ready, above all, to see food in a different light. Because once you learn the secrets of ancient ship kitchens, you'll never look at a piece of salted meat, a hard biscuit, or a dried fish the same way again. What went on inside the dark holds of those ships? What risks were involved in each meal? What flavors were endured out of sheer necessity? And what techniques were developed just to survive another day? These are questions that many avoid asking. But in this video, we're going to face them head-on. Because sometimes the darkest secrets lie in the most unlikely places. And the kitchen of an ancient ship can hide much more than just food. Stay with us. What comes next may change your perspective forever. For centuries, ships were the link between distant worlds. Wooden vessels, powered by sails, faced long and uncertain journeys across the oceans. During these epic crossings, there was a silent but constant challenge. How to keep food edible for months, even without access to refrigeration, electricity, or any kind of modern technology. This seemingly simple question gave rise to a set of practices and strategies that, although primitive, anticipated many of the techniques that are part of today's industrial food processes. At that time, feeding a crew on the high seas was not just a matter of logistics. It was a daily battle against time, climate, and decomposition. Food had to withstand humidity, heat, lack of ventilation, and the constant movement of the ship. The solution? Preservation methods that today would be recognized as ancestors of industrial food preservation systems. Before we get into the details, it is important to understand that ancient ships functioned as autonomous microenvironments with limited resources and no possibility of frequent resupply. Therefore, every decision about food storage and preparation had to be extremely calculated. There was no room for waste. In this context, a mistake could be fatal, both for the body and for the social order of the ship. The main foods taken on board were those that offered greater durability and less risk of rapid contamination. Fresh bread, for example, was a luxury that disappeared in the first days of the voyage. To replace it, the famous sea biscuit was used, a type of extremely hard biscuit made with flour and water, baked until it reached maximum dehydration. This food, although difficult to chew, was resistant to time and mold. Interestingly, this rudimentary technique represents one of the first ways of controlling water activity in food, an essential concept in modern industry. Another fundamental example was the use of salt in preserving meat and fish. The products were covered with generous layers of salt and stored in wooden barrels, which slowed the action of bacteria and extended their shelf life. This practice can be compared to today's industrial curing and salting processes, which use the same basic principle, reducing the presence of free moisture and modifying the environment to prevent microbial proliferation. In addition, Techniques such as smoking and sun-drying were also common, especially on longer voyages or in tropical regions. These practices, although simple, involved in-depth empirical knowledge about the behavior of food under different conditions. Today, similar methods are applied in controlled environments with equipment that regulates temperature, humidity, and airflow, ensuring quality standards and food safety. But all of this has its origins in these maritime adaptations. As for beverages, drinking water was extremely difficult to preserve. In many cases, after weeks in barrels, the water became cloudy and unfit for consumption. The alternative was to consume fermented beverages, such as weak beer or diluted wine, which in addition to being more stable, had natural antiseptic properties. This replacement reflects, in a way, the logic of controlled fermentation, which is now used on a large scale for the production of foods and beverages with a long shelf life. The environment in the kitchens on ships, known as cambuses, was extremely challenging. Small spaces with unstable stoves fueled by coal or wood forced cooks to develop safe and quick preparation methods. There was no way to keep food fresh for long. Therefore, everything that was prepared had to be minimally processed, with a focus on durability and the ability to be reheated or reused. In a way, we can see this as the embryo of the concepts of semi-prepared or easy-to-prepare foods, which today dominate the convenience food industry. Another curious aspect is the use of primitive packaging, such as barrels, linen bags, wooden boxes, and ceramic pots, which were intended to isolate food from contact with humidity, light, and excessive heat. This rudimentary logic already pointed to an intuitive understanding of what the industry today calls physical barriers against spoilage. Today, we use UV-protected plastics, modified atmosphere films, and vacuum techniques. But all of this arose from the need to protect food in the harsh environment of a ship. Another key point in this context was controlling the stock and the shelf life of each food item. On board, there was a strict discipline for consuming the most perishable products in the first few days of the voyage and carefully rationing the most durable items over time. This required organization, constant monitoring, and predictability. Over time, such practices became an essential part of the logistics planning of the food supply chain. The idea of inventory management and stock rotation, so present in large industries today, was born precisely in this scenario of absolute scarcity. But perhaps the darkest and most fascinating aspect of these floating kitchens was their capacity for improvisation. When food was scarce, the solutions were often radical. Soup made from boiled leather, broths made from dried bones, infusions made from the peels of nearly rotten fruits. Everything was reused, recycled, and modified. This attitude, although extreme, echoes the current principles of reducing waste and reprocessing food, increasingly valued in a world concerned with sustainability. And even the mistakes, so common and often tragic, served as lessons for the future. Scurvy, caused by vitamin C deficiency, led to the mandatory inclusion of citrus fruits on voyages, one of the first documented attempts at programmed nutritional fortification, a concept that is now central to the development of enriched and balanced products. Therefore, when we talk about food on old ships, we are not just recalling historical curiosities. We are looking at the origins of the technical and scientific principles that guide industrial food processing today. From preservation by salting to the full use of ingredients, from rudimentary packaging to logistical control, everything points to the same goal: to preserve, feed, and ensure food safety, even in the most adverse environments. And that is precisely why understanding how sailors of the past prepared and protected their food is so relevant. Because it reveals that long before the digital age, automation, and multinational industries, the spirit of innovation already inhabited the small, dark kitchens of old ships. They had no sensors or laboratories, but they had instinct, need, and ingenuity. And with that, they created the foundations of a science that today feeds billions.